Hello, and a very warm welcome to all to this latest edition of the webinar series co-hosted by ET Auto and ICCT. That's the International Center for International Council for Clean Transportation. And this edition, the theme of this edition of the webinar series is From Fuel to Future, India's Adoption Towards Zero Emission Vehicles. As we all know, we are globally moving towards a common target of carbon neutrality. And towards that, any and every initiative towards reducing emission is a much needed act, both in terms of governments doing their bits, citizens doing their bits, and of course, the industry players. So in today's webinar, we will first be introduced to the latest global research by ICCT called Vision 2025, which will focus on the implications of the supply side regulations adopted over the past 3 years on zero emission vehicle adoption and CO2 emissions from road transport. And we will have very soon a presentation by Jacob Teter, my apologies, independent advisor and program consultant with ICCT, and also the co-author of the report. We will also hear about some lessons around what international regulations might bring to Indian policy discussions and what benefits we might expect to see from more ambitious fuel economy standards on light-duty and heavy-duty vehicles being considered in the current round of CAFE norms update in India, which we as all know is moving towards the third phase of the CAFE norms. We will then hear from ICCT's India Managing Director, Amit Bhatt, about electrification of the transportation sector in India, reflections on the proposed CAFE norms and vision for zero emission vehicles in the sector. And then, of course, we'll open up the floor to other panelists to react to and add further reflections on the points brought out by the experts from ICCT. So it's also a pleasure that we are joined by two distinguished speakers. One of them, my pleasure to welcome Sherry Frosch, more popular as Sherry, program manager at Ragiri Foundation, and also one of the first female EV owners in Delhi NCR. And we will soon be also joined by Dr. O.P. Agarwal, distinguished fellow at policy think tank Niti Aayog. So without further ado, it's my pleasure and honor to invite Jacob on stage, to this online stage, to share his presentations. And Jacob, ladies and gentlemen, joins us from France. So thanks once again, Jacob, for sparing your time and matching your schedule with ours and to be available for this webinar. Appreciate it. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Samantra, for the warm introduction. And thanks everyone for joining and making time to learn a bit about the benefits of the transition to zero emission vehicles and India's progress to date and future potential in this ZEV transition. My name is Jacob Teter again, and I want to share a few key findings from a report that serves as a kind of global status update for the road transport sector, which the ICCT released in January of this year, and which was authored by Arijit Sen, Josh Miller, and me. In 2020, the ICCT launched its Vision 2050 series with a report showing what policies would be needed to catalyze technology adoption in road transport to cut CO2 emissions at a pace commensurate with the goal of limiting expected global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius. as laid out in the COP21 in Paris, now nearly 1 decade ago. Since road transport accounts for more than 20% of global CO2 emissions, it's very important to track policy and technology progress in the road sector very closely. Even today, road transport relies mostly on fossil-derived fuels, mostly on oil products, but also natural gas, and operates on infrastructure that is the inheritance of trillions of dollars of investments over many decades. To align with our climate targets, this sector must change radically in little more than a generation. The reports in the ZEV Transition Updates series articulate in some degree of detail what kinds of policy interventions and technology pathways show the greatest promise to substantially and rapidly cut emissions. In the next 10 minutes, I'll take you through some of the key findings of the latest ZEV Update study and highlight some key lessons for India's ZEV transition. So when ICCT first embarked on these global progress reports, well-to-wheel CO2 emissions from the operations of all road vehicles were projected to rise slightly or essentially flatline. Back in 2021, based on the policies adopted at that time, there was no prospect for road transport emissions to decline. But a lot has changed in just the past few years. Supply-side regulations like the European Union's CO2 standards for cars and vans, and more recently, its heavy-duty CO2 standards, analogous regulations on light and heavy-duty vehicles in the United States, efficiency standards on light-duty vehicles in Australia, and ambitious zero-emission vehicle or electric vehicle sales requirements in Canada and the UK, among others, have really moved the needle. In our latest assessment, for the first time ever, global road transport emissions are projected to decline. Regulations passed in just the past 3 years have cut cumulative emissions expected between now and 2050 by around 23 gigatons. That's equivalent to the annual CO2 emissions of the US, China, India, European Union, and Japan combined. They've also reduced expected fuel consumption from now to 2050 by about 240 exajoules. That's equivalent to the total lifetime fuel consumption of around 350 million gasoline cars, out of a current global stock that is around 1.1 billion cars. Further emissions reductions could be realized if countries around the world were able to translate proposed policies into binding regulations and to make good on international declarations like the Global ZEV Declaration, which India is a signatory to, formulated at the Glasgow COP, and the Global MOU on zero-emission medium and heavy-duty vehicles. This is reflected in our momentum scenario. Finally, if ZEV deployment were to proceed at the pace commensurate with the most ambitious global goals, with leading markets phasing out conventional internal combustion engine vehicles in light-duty vehicles by 2035 and in trucks and buses by 2040, and with other markets following in ICE phase-out such that all new vehicle sales are ZEVs by 2045, then the road sector could find itself on a trajectory that is aligned, but really only just barely aligned with the Paris target to limit global average temperature rise to well below 2 degrees. Let's zoom in on the European Union CO2 standards as a case study of the impacts of supply-side regulations. First, it's worth defining this term. When we at the ICCT talk about supply-side regulations, we're talking about regulations that do one of two things. They either require automakers to sell cars that meet fuel economy or equivalently CO2 or greenhouse gas emission standards, or they require automakers to sell a gradually increasing share of zero-emission vehicles, which typically include battery electric vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, and in some cases also plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, though in the case of plug-in hybrids, shares of these vehicles in overall ZEV sales are generally set to decline over time based on caps or on decreasing credit multipliers. The EU's CO2 standards on cars and vans are an excellent example of standards that build on decades of regulatory experience. The EU first implemented mandatory fleet-wide average CO2 emission standards in 2009, and then updated them in 2019, and then again in 2023. The yellow line shown here shows how weighted average emissions of new car sales declined under the standards. First, as measured under the New European Drive Cycle, or NEDC, and more recently, based on an effort to better reflect emissions of real-world operations under the World Light Duty Test Procedure, or WLTP, as shown in blue. Monitoring and evaluation projects conducted both to inform standard setting and to measure the actual impacts after a standard has been implemented show that reductions in fuel consumption at a per vehicle level translate to reduced fuel consumption in aggregate, with energy security benefits at a national level, to reduced emissions, and indeed the EU's latest 2023 standards were explicitly formulated to contribute to the EU's goal and their Fit for 55 legislation to reach net zero. And at the household level, they contribute to reduced fuel and operating expenditures and overall lower household outlays on transportation. The most recent standard limits for cars are shown in the dotted lines. And in 5-year time steps, the emissions of new cars should drop, for instance, by 55% as compared with 2021 emissions by 2030, and to zero, meaning effectively selling only cars that don't lead to any operational CO2 emissions by 2035. Focusing in on the blue line, which shows the most recent data, based on the CO2 limits for the period 2021 to 2024, weighted average emissions of new cars and vans registered across the EU were required to meet emissions limits 25% lower than the 5-year period from 2015 to 2019. And indeed, according to the most recent data from the European Environment Agency, CO2 emissions of new passenger cars registered in Europe fell steadily from 2019 to 2023, dropping by 28% over those 4 years. And the main way that European automakers have met these limits is by selling electric cars in increasing shares. Indeed, the dramatic rise in EV sales shares in the European car market coincided perfectly with the tighter emission standards. And if you look at this abrupt increase in EV sales, you could legitimately raise the question about how all these EVs were brought to market in such a short time frame, and how there was such a step change in EV sales shares in over just under a single year. And the answer is that automakers have consistently been able to adapt their investment, production, and marketing strategies to the regulatory landscape. That is, given long-term signals and with the right regulatory design, most automakers are able to adapt and meet even very stringent and ambitious standards. Specifically, one part of compliance is marketing. In 2020, the tighter emission standards effectively forced automakers to refocus their marketing strategies. Instead of allocating nearly all of their advertising budget to the models that yielded the highest profit margins, the regulations in 2020 in the EU forced them to advertise more EVs. And the result was that over a single year, the share of ads focusing on EVs jumped from less than a fifth to over a half. So the effectiveness of a regulation depends on crucial elements of its design. The European CO2 standards have incorporated many important design elements that have ensured that they're effective. Other countries that have implemented world-leading and ambitious standards on cars are shown here. These include ZEV or EV sales shares requirements in California, the UK, and Canada, and fuel efficiency and greenhouse gas emission standards in the USA and Australia. And based on the stringency of these standards, the majority of cars sold across all of these markets will be ZEVs by 2030. In some cases, standards will drive a transition to 100% or nearly 100% ZEVs by 2035. This is consistent with the pace of zero-emission vehicle adoption that would be needed to align the road sector with the Paris climate targets. So then what makes an effective supply-side regulation? 3 simple design elements are highlighted here. First is to design an ambitious but achievable set of targets and to pair these with flexibilities. Taking again the example of the EU, car makers are able to form credit pools to meet the standards. And that means that this year, many European, North American, and Japanese OEMs are buying credits from Tesla, Volvo, or Polestar. Credit trading and banking are other flexibility mechanisms that enable automakers to plan their investments and technology and marketing strategies. Another important element is penalties. Typically, these take the form of fines that are set at a high enough level to serve as an effective deterrent, meaning that it remains substantially more expensive to not meet the standard than to provide the technologies that enable compliance. Finally, the most resilient standards tend to be gradual ones, with targets that increase linearly year over year. One potential pitfall of the EU regulations is that they're designed as a step function, as we saw in the figures shown on previous slides. The standards require improvements of 15% this year, 55% in 2030, and zero tailpipe emissions in 2035. But they don't require that OEMs continue to steadily reduce emissions in the intervening years. This has meant that automakers have had to make step changes in their sales and it's similarly implied major changes in their investments and strategies at those years when the regulations are binding, which not only removes the incentives for consistent gradual improvements. Recall the 2024 dip in EV sales that we saw again in the previous figure. But it has also led to a cycle of hand-wringing and wolf crying in the year preceding this step change in standards when they tighten, as we are indeed seeing now. Coming back to the EU and how its recent regulation can inform the policy debate in India, let's look at the projected cumulative CO2 emission implications of adopted and proposed policies in both places. In the EU, regulations adopted over just the past 3 years have realized nearly 3/4 of the cumulative CO2 emission reduction potential that could be realized through 2050 under even the most ambitious global targets. In this respect, the EU serves as a model for ambitious world-leading supply-side regulations and how they can contribute to climate targets. And the EU is now more focused than ever on the need to maintain these targets, not only to meet its climate goals, but also to continue to innovate and augment its competitiveness in value chains like EV batteries and EVs that will be crucial over the coming century. India is also considering ambitious legislation such as the proposed CAFE 3 and 4 norms and fiscal policies like the PME drive, whose impacts on, for instance, the 2- and 3-wheeler market could provide important emissions cuts, reducing emissions by more than 30% of the potential under the most ambitious scenario. The potential benefits of the proposed CAFE norms and of PME drive are considerable. They could translate to oil savings between now and 2050 that exceed the total lifetime fuel consumption of all of the gasoline cars on India's roads today. And further regulatory action, including new regulations on trucks in particular, could capture even greater emissions cuts and bring India's net zero by 2070 ambitions within reach. And those are the cuts that are shown by the ambition gap, so 3.2 billion tons of CO2 emissions. Thanks so much for your attention, and I'd encourage you to take a look at the report for an in-depth discussion of the impacts of recently adopted policies and of recent trends in EV sales on projected CO2 emissions over the coming decades, with more kind of regional resolution and country-level resolution and more discussion of the policies that have really moved the needle over the past 3 years. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jacob Data, sharing this very comprehensive and informative presentation. One query on my mind, Jacob, when it comes to emission-free transportation, I mean, okay, let's qualify it very more precisely, tailpipe emission-free transportation. Europe has been leading in terms of EV adoption, but then it's a kind of a little bit of a mixed story there. Again, because there's a downward trend of government incentives. So what is the current scenario there in Europe, particularly in France, when it comes to the EV adoption rate?
So EVs have been adopted at increasing sales shares in recent years, in every year with the exception of 2024. And there are a couple potential reasons for the downward tick in EV sales shares on a European level in 2024. One is the removal of subsidies in Germany for electric vehicles. I think France's sales shares have continued to steadily increase year on year. But what we very much expect to see, and what indeed the sales data from January of 2025 is already starting to show, is that despite a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of debate and discussion about the potential for OEMs in the European market to meet the 2025 CO2 emission standards, EV sales shares have indeed ticked up considerably, also in Germany. And this is a pattern that we've seen already and was shown in the presentation in 2020. And it's something that we very much expect to see in 2025. There may be a couple auto manufacturers who aren't able to meet the standards, might have to pay penalties. There's an ongoing discussion about exactly what the penalty framework might look like, whether there might be the opportunity for banking over years to reduce the penalties, in particular on European OEMs. But in general, most OEMs are going to be able to shift their marketing strategy and their technology strategy and meet the standards. And that's something that we've seen before and we expect to see again. Sales shares are actually quite high, and we'll expect them to tick up considerably in 2025.
Indeed, as it is expected that electrics are the future, but yes, the journey towards that reaching that critical scale of the industry is not going to be that a little bit of a kind of learnings will be there, and I'm sure eventually the critical scale will be achieved. Now, talking about emission, Jacob, in the new Euro 6 norms, there's also the talk about the component of tire particles, tire dust, which will be also counted as part of the emission from the vehicle. We'll talk about that later on when we come back to the discussion phase. But now it's my pleasure to bring on stage Amit Bhatt, the India Managing Director of ICCT. And let's learn from Amit about the whole journey towards emission-free transportation in India. And also, let's say, before we reach that eventual stage of carbon neutrality, at least the increasingly lowering trend of emissions into vehicles, and towards that, the role of the upcoming stages of CAFE norms. So, Amit, over to you, because ICCT has been playing an instrumental role when it comes to kind of supporting the policy framework for electrification of automobiles in India. Look forward to hearing from you about the insights.
Thanks a lot, Sumantra. And again, I think fantastic presentation by Jacob. I think a couple of things that really drove the point which Jacob presented. And we all know that any new technology that comes on board requires a little bit of help and support till the time it is mature enough to kind of go on its own. And I think with the electrification, there are largely two kinds of policies. One is the demand side support, and the other is the supply side regulation. Now, I think what Jacob presented very well was how was the supply side regulation driving the electrification story in the at a global level. Specifically, some very interesting insight was presented from the Europe. So I think what is interesting is that if you look at efficiency, or even if you look at emission, India largely follows the European journey with a little bit of lag, maybe 5 years lag, so as to see. And so I think, so the big question is, what's the learning that we can derive from Europe, especially in India? Now, if you look at the way Europe has been improving its efficiency, I think the same set of efficiency improvement need also to come to India, especially when in the last G20, which was held in India. India was the secretary for G20. We committed to doubling the energy efficiency by 2030. Now, if that's the target, how do we double the efficiency of transport sector is going to be key. And I think that's where we firmly believe that supply side regulation over and above the demand side policy push that has been happening in India are going to play a very important role. So the draft regulation for fuel efficiency standards, or CAFE standards as we call them in India, came out in June of last year. They are currently in discussion and in the process of being finalizations. Hopefully that regulation should come out soon. And I think that will really drive the improvement. Why? Because I think that regulation is a binding regulation, which means all the OEMs have to comply to that regulation. And once you make any regulation which is binding in nature, we see that the adoption happens much fast. So we are very hopeful that CAFE regulation will provide that initial thrust, which will catalyze a larger level of change, which will result in a much larger uptake on electrification, as we see as of now in India. So that would be my comment, Sumantra.
Right, and basis my interactions with the leaders from some of the leading OEMs, most of them, if not almost all of them, believe that without having a significant share of EVs in their fleet, it's going to be near impossible to meet the upcoming CAFE norms, which are increasingly getting stringent. That's a global trend. Emission norms are getting increasingly stringent, and CAFE 3 will kind of really make it almost necessary to have a sizable share of EVs in the portfolio of OEMs. Talking about that, decarbonization, which is the global trend, that's the overall kind of driving factor, decarbonization. So in terms of the EV adoption, electrification megatrend, 2- and 3-wheelers have really kind of been taking the lead, and they're literally the drivers of electrification in the Indian automotive industry. But what about the decarbonization trend or decarbonization efforts on the freight side? Because the government, the Ministry of Heavy Industries, have also made it clear that trucking, for example, which is a major, as a sector, it's a major contributor to carbon emissions, needs to go to the electric way. How do you see that kind of journey progressing? Because pretty sure it's not going to be the same story as 2-wheelers or 3-wheelers.
No, absolutely. I can give my perspective, and Dr. Agarwal is also here. He can share right from Niti. So I think what's really interesting is that if you look at the PME drive, the new avatar of FAME, has really for the first time earmarked a specific corpus for electrification of trucks. The reason why it is important is that trucks are roughly 3% of our motor vehicle fleet, but almost 40-45% of the emission comes from them. Until now, we have been neglecting them. I mean that's the sorry for the better choice of word, but I think what we have to realize that if we have to meet the climate target, then you just cannot ignore the segment which is contributing the most emission. Even if you look at Delhi and the particulate matter emission, the bulk of it within Delhi comes from commercial vehicles. So whether it is the climate target or the public health target, you cannot achieve them without doing something about the freight vehicle. And I think what we have seen from Europe and also from Jacob's presentation, that electrification of medium and heavy duty vehicle is also picking up very, very fast. So I think as a proof of concept, we have seen that PME Drive has earmarked 500 crores for initial truck deployment. But I am very hopeful as these electrification of trucks increases, it will also be cost advantageous for OEMs, for the shippers, logistics providers to electrify trucks. And that's where we'll see a much faster uptake. But for now, the 500 crores can catalyze the initial spurt, which will create a bigger change. But again, Dr. Agarwal can probably add more from the side.
Right, at least, though not a very impressive figure of 500 crore, considering the support or the scale of the industry, but still it can play the catalyst role, as you rightly mentioned. And in the recent interview with the Additional Secretary of Ministry of Heavy Industries, the Additional Secretary said that, Dr. Hanif Qureshi, he said that the initial focus will start off with heavy trucks flying in controlled environments, namely terminals, ports, and airport terminals, and then eventually, go to a wider this thing. So I think it's a step-by-step approach, which is also, I think, a smarter approach and a sustainable approach. But let's hear it from the man himself who represents the think tank of Niti Aayog in this webinar, Dr. O.P. Agarwal, a distinguished fellow. Dr. Agarwal, thank you for sparing your time. I understand that you have had some meetings, but really appreciate you accommodating this webinar in your busy schedule. So once again, a hearty welcome. And your thoughts, sir, in terms of, from your perspective, what are the lowest hanging fruits, if I may call them, to accelerate the EV transition in India?
Thanks, Sumantra. It's very difficult for me to say no to Amit. So if Amit says come for this, I have to think 20 times before I say I can't come. So thanks for having me, Amit. But I think the question is it's a very interesting question. I remember both Amit and I were working in WRI together. This is about 6 or 7 years ago when WRI really started on the EV journey. Amit was leading it at that time. And we came into the Niti Aayog at that stage. If you remember that, Amit, very early stages. And the whole thinking was, if you looked at different segments, one question that kept coming was, why will people buy electric vehicles? The other one why will people make electric vehicles? And it was a very interesting chicken and egg situation that why should I buy electric if I don't have charging? And charging operators would say, how can I set it up unless you have electric vehicles? So I think we've come a long way from there.
It was a chicken and egg situation.
It's a chicken and egg situation. But I think that vicious cycle, to my mind, has got broken, and we have done much better than what I thought, at least. So I'm really encouraged, and I don't know if Amit has the same view, but I think we progressed much better than what I thought we would do. But today, if you ask me for low-hanging fruit, what I would tend to do is divide that whole profile into segments. And as you said, 2 and 3 wheelers have picked up. They've picked up pretty much, that's done pretty well. Cars is slow. We have to think of what you need to do with cars. Buses have been picking up. There are some challenges with buses. Urban public buses are picking up. Urban freight vehicles are also picking up because they say economic advantages with urban freight vehicles. The big challenge is intercity trucking, long distance trucking, because as Amit said, 3% of the vehicles, but 45% of the emissions. So we really have to pay attention to them. And as both of you mentioned very rightly, I think attention has not been paid to them because we were trying to kickstart things in other segments. Today, we've seen fairly good progress in other segments. And that is why I think it's a good time to start paying attention to highway trucking. I have also always maintained that let's not look at what is the West doing and all these things. In the sense, what percentage of your vehicles in a certain segment have converted to electric. More than that, I think what is important is to look at what share of your vehicle miles has got converted to electric. Say if I drive only 20 kilometers in a day, supporting me to buy electric doesn't make sense. But suppose I'm driving 100 kilometers every day, yes, you want to make sure I convert to electric. So I think let's keep that also in mind. Let's not get carried away by what share of vehicles has converted. So to me, the low-hanging fruit fleet is, or rather low-hanging vehicles are fleets. Auto rickshaws, taxis, these are the ones that do longer distances in a day. Urban freight vehicles, and I would say government vehicles, company-owned pool vehicles. These are the ones that keep driving around. I think in that process, we will create volumes which will create the supporting infrastructure that will encourage even personal vehicles to come in. So to me, the low-hanging fruit are really fleet vehicles.
Right.
I would start paying a lot of attention to highway trucking. But here we have to think a little carefully. What really is the problem with highway trucking? I mean, why is it not happening, or what are the challenges with highway trucking? I see 2 or 3 different things. There is a perception that they travel a long distance and you need a lot of charging to be available on the highways. That is one perception. What I also hear from various studies that have been done both by ICCT and some others, that actually these trucks don't do more than 300 kilometers in a day. A large number of them don't do more than 300 kilometers. So why are we creating a barrier by just saying they travel a long distance? Let's get down to numbers. I think the moment we start doing that, we will start seeing things as more plausible. The second is what Amit himself told me at one stage. I've asked him for a report which he has not yet sent, but I think it's still work in progress. But if you look at, say, the 10 or 20 major corridors in the country, you will find that there are designated spots where trucks stop in any case. I, for one, know this very well because I was in the Assam cadre, and I know that on the border with Assam, trucks stop for days together. Right? So on every of these highways, you will find there are certain stops where trucks stop in any case. Now, those are the places to set up charging hubs. It's not a big deal. You're not asking them to stop for additional time for this. So I think this is one exercise we need to do, is identify the traffic pattern or the travel pattern of trucks on, say, the 20 biggest corridors in the country, map out where they stop, identify those as places where we set up charging facilities. If you give that data to any private operator, he will also come and be happy to set up. Of course, land has to be provided, but it's easier to provide land in those areas than in cities. That is one. The second is there is this whole problem about your batteries are so heavy. So there is a kind of a payload compensation that is being sought, that if my batteries are so heavy, and usually the trucks are given a permit for 10 tons, how do I compensate the fact that the battery is very heavy?
Right.
Now, here, one challenge that comes up is that what is the load-bearing capacity of your road? You know, at the end of the day, you can make a truck 40 tons, but will it damage the road a huge extent? So that is something that we need to look at.
Collateral damage.
Exactly. And is there a way in which you could, some novel idea of, is it possible for a kind of a trailer? So you add an axle. So if it's a 40-ton truck, but you distribute that load over multiple axles, then the pressure on the road comes down. So some innovation needs to happen there. I'm also, I'm probably a little more considerate towards swapping than many others that I have come across. And the reason I say this is, I think swapping gives you the luxury of being able to move with a smaller battery weight and swap it more frequently. So suppose a truck carried battery weight for, say, 200 kilometers in 2 modules, say 100 kilometers, 100 kilometers. But somewhere in the 100 kilometers, he's bound to stop. Swap 100 kilometers to get another 100 kilometers. It hasn't taken you too much time. You can go that much. Your load has come down.
Yeah.
Something innovative. I'm just sort of saying something.
Then you address the challenge of the dead weight which you carry. Otherwise,
Exactly.
clear at least some of that to carry the payload.
Absolutely. So these are some things that we need to think innovatively, coming up with these. I'm just giving a rough idea, but these are some of the things that I think would be.
Very well said, Dr. Bal.
Let me stop with that. Go ahead, Sumatra.
Yeah, no, the key takeaway is you're saying that fleet has to be focused on because of their duty cycle, and it also helps because in the cause for EV adoption, because EVs, the more they are run, the better the savings would be, and which is what the commercial vehicle applications want. They need lesser TCO. That's not so much of a concern for passenger vehicles, for example.
True.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and that will also give the industry that economy of scale, which in other words will help also reduce the cost of, let's say, sub-assemblies and key components. So it's a virtuous cycle, I would say, and of course the mapping of the stoppages and all the data I'm sure CPOs or charge point operators would be more than happy to
Very
get that
happy.
data, because then they would know where exactly to put their charging stations and thereby enhance the average utilization levels and get better ROI, because that's been a challenge for them, at least in the initial stage. Since you are here, I would also like to ask you one question, sir, is that, not many may know that you are a key author of the National Urban Transport Policy 2006.
Even I have forgotten.
but no, the question is, do you think that policy needs to be revisited, or what are the new solutions that are present today, that can be incorporated, and something which perhaps was not perhaps definitely was not available when you were drafting that the urban transport policy of 2006?
No, I think that's a very interesting question, Sumanta, and my answer to that is a very vehement yes. It needs to be reviewed. See, this policy was approved in 2006, but the thinking behind it had a very extensive consultation process. See, it was around 2003 that this kind of a thing really, was given a bit of shape. Now, in 2003, we had only the first phase of the first line of the Delhi Metro. After that, so many metros have come up. People's travel patterns must have changed.
Yes.
We need to find out. Ola and Uber were not there at that time. These freight, these aggregated services were not there at that time. And today I have seen many state transport departments are confused about whether Olas and Ubers are a good thing or not a good thing, right? So I think these are things that need to come into the policy today. Electric mobility was mentioned in the policy in passing, just to say we need to get more fuel efficient, more cleaner technologies into it. It didn't say very much more.
That was the NEMMP, if I'm not wrong, National Electric Mobility Mission Plan.
The policy, I mean, the urban transport policy was much earlier.
Yeah, was earlier than that.
National urban transport policy sometime in 2003.
Yes.
It did mention the need to move towards cleaner fuels. And it did mention electric mobility, but it was just a small paragraph, not much more than that.
Right.
So we progressed a lot more. And I think much deeper consideration of electric mobility needs to come into that policy. In the urban areas that, land will be provided with the municipal corporations for charging. These kind of things need to come into that policy. There have been a number of other issues about aggregated public bus services. Now, these were not known at that point of time. So I think it's been, the last 20 years since the policy was framed. A lot has changed. And I think the new policy is needed, which takes into account the kind of changes that have taken place. Okay. So to answer your question in very brief, yes, it needs revisiting.
And since we are talking about policy, sir, what do you think are the highest priority policies that should be adopted at the national level, at the state level, and even at the local level, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or basically local pollutant emissions? Because the mobility space is evolving at a very swift pace, and new opportunities thereby are also emerging.
I think on the emissions, we do have the policies. We just need to implement them a little more aggressively. If you would ask me at a much higher scale, I would say that, most of the emissions growth will happen in cities. We are talking of getting to a $30 trillion economy from 3 trillion out of the 27 trillion growth. 25 trillion will be in cities. The country is desperately looking for more jobs to be created. Most of that will be in cities. So cities are fundamental. Yet we don't have an urbanization policy. How are we going to urbanize? Is there a case for more decentralized urbanization? Or is it going to be all the Delhis and Bangalores and Hyderabad that will grow?
That's also a scary proposition. If that
Exactly. Now that I think is now, unfortunately, we've not been able to do that. We have an urban transport policy, but we don't have an urbanization policy. I've often said we don't have the mother. So you need an urbanization policy. It's complex. It's not easy. That's the reason it's not there.
Yeah.
But that is one exercise that needs to be taken up. If you're talking about what are policies critical for us today for India's development and emissions reduction, I think a good urbanization policy is critical.
And good urbanization policy and a decentralized urbanization policy, as you rightly said.
I mean,
Because
whoever is drafting that, let them think about it, let them do the analysis. There are various tools which have come up by which you can make out what are the emissions level at different sizes of cities, different forms of mobility.
Right.
I think those tools can be deployed to find out what pattern of urbanization.
Right, indeed. Very well points there, sir. And thank you for sharing them. So now let's go to the next speaker. As I mentioned earlier, she is also the first female electric vehicle owner in the Delhi NCR region. Sherry Banafrosh, program manager at Ragheri Foundation, who is more popular as Sherry. Sherry, once again, welcome to this edition of the webinar series. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you,
As if I may call it, pioneer among consumers, EV consumers in India, what is your take on accelerating the adoption of EVs in India? And from the policy perspective, what are the policy initiatives that the government can take based, let's say, on experiences of customers, users of EVs like you, to accelerate the EV uptake and therefore kind of build that critical industry scale, thereby build that critical scale?
Thanks. And that's a good question. So we've been talking a lot about carbon emissions in this talk, and I kind of want to digress a little bit because I feel like talking about air pollution in cities is kind of the immediate and urgent need that a lot of people kind of viscerally feel and identify with.
Sorry to interrupt there, Sherry. Was that a key trigger for you to opt for an EV at the first place?
That was. So, for me, it was a very kind of a public health thing, and as a cyclist, my children are cycling on the street occasionally, so that was a very important factor for me, because it's a gas chamber on the road. You're on the road, you're breathing in the emissions, you feel it, and the children are sitting in buses, they're on cycles. It's a very immediate thing that we want to do, and as Sir said, Agarwal sir talked about the vicious cycle, right? So you're talking about people who if they can afford it, will not want to walk or cycle or take public transportation, which we know are the right kind of priorities for transportation, because they will because the air pollution is very great. So then the vicious cycle is that then they will insist on taking a car and for shorter and shorter trips, and that will add to the congestion and the pollution and all the problems that you're feeling. So that is kind of the second vicious cycle that we're seeing here. And the other thing is that there are two things that we want to kind of focus on here. One is that the traffic is causing congestion, right? There's traffic jams everywhere. You go, and like in a Delhi or a Gurgaon, that would be every 100 meters, we'll have this massive traffic jam. And so that's the number of vehicles. And the second is the kind of the pollution that is being caused by the vehicles. So on a demand side, if you want people to kind of uptake more EVs, you have the supply side mandates, you have the demand drivers, but you also have to start looking at things like LEZs. So you're seeing in cities around Europe is that when you restrict the number of vehicles that can enter a zone, a particularly congested kind of a hotspot zone of high pollution, high emissions, then not only are you reducing the congestion, which opens the way for things like buses to move faster, which is one of the biggest problems we're having with buses in the NCR region, is that they're coming too late, they're moving too slowly. You're also opening the way for non-motorized transport, becomes much more safer, becomes much less polluted. And then you're choosing those few vehicles that are the least polluting to allow them on the road, right? So you're reducing the traffic dramatically, and you're converting the kind of fleet to electric. And so then that obviously also creates like a huge incentive for people to move to EV. So that was kind of my two things that I wanted to add for this, as a cyclist, as a mother, kind of playing on the women's side. And that's something that we're doing is creating these low emission zones in areas. Talking about areas like heritage sites, we're talking about really polluted, narrow street kind of city centers. You're looking at, I mean, I would think that entire cities like Delhi and Gurgaon, which should count as low emission zone, because we're looking at, London and some of these places where you've really succeeded in creating these very the low emission zones that dramatically cut emissions for the city with healthcare benefits.
Right. Your organization, Rakiri Foundation, if I'm from what I understand, your core goal is safer mobility, safer streets, and also inclusive mobility, for the society. So talking about safer mobility, it's not only about less accidents, but it's also about healthier options, healthier environment for mobility. So towards that, how if you look at this two-pronged approach of safety in terms of the safety, as we know, the conventional definition of safety, and the other part from the health implications part, what do you think should be the core drivers for a more evolved and more effective policy measures? I mean, Dr. Agarwal earlier talked about the need for smart thinking in terms of urbanization. So in that context, what would you suggest?
I mean, obviously, we always look at walking, cycling, and public transportation as the beginning of any such kind of conversation, right? So you do want to talk about better footpaths, better cycle lanes, but I mean, in the context of coming on the road and breathing in the pollution and being stuck in traffic jams, reducing the traffic volumes at some point with this kind of congestion charges or LEZs, or those are going to be key to the process.
I mean, here talking about dedicated spaces for cycling or dedicated paths for cycling in the midst of city, and not too far from where I'm sitting. I'm here in Mumbai. At the Bandra Kurla complex was the first area where there was dedicated pathways for cycling, but unfortunately they have been lying largely unused for the objective for which they were created. But the factors being also they are not a safety aspect for cyclists and all. So I think it has to be very inclusive, kind of holistic approach, because in silos, while you may create the infrastructure, but if it doesn't fit into the overall puzzle well, I think it doesn't serve the purpose.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at cycling for commute, cycling for errands, not just cycling for exercise, which is what I think we've dedicated a lot of our infrastructure to. The other thing I just learned, which I thought was really kind of interesting and mind-blowing in a way, is that when you're cycling or using any kind of active transport, you're breathing at twice the rate that you're normally breathing in a car. So, I mean, not only are you at this heightened exposure because you're on the road versus, like what you're seeing in the air pollution monitors, like up on a hill, some pretty, green area. So you're much higher exposure on the road versus in those monitors, but you're also double of that high exposure is what you're breathing in and what children are breathing in, right? So they're the ones walking on the streets and cycling and whatnot. So, I mean, it's just a very dramatic thing that we have to, building cycle lanes and all this is great, but we really have to reduce these emissions.
I mean, as you guys sharing your views, I'm just wondering if I were a cycling enthusiast, and not only for my health, but also if I would, let's say, would be someone who would prefer to cycle to work, and I live in Delhi NCR, perhaps it will not encourage me. The environment will not encourage me because of the AQI, and especially in those months of the year, September till about Jan, then winter months. So I think it's a very kind of peculiar situation there, because I think while you may have takers for cycling as a means of mobility, but at the same time the environment becomes a big hurdle.
And also I think that a lot of people don't realize this, that you're talking about Delhi NCR being at AQI of 300, 400 in the winters, and maybe Bombay or Bangalore being at 30, 40, but 30, 40 is not that much safer. Because the curve of the air pollution and the effects it has, it goes up dramatically, from the safe level, which is 5 to 40, just dramatically goes up, and then it levels off. So we have to then talk about processes that will end up getting us to zero. We can't say that, okay, we have slightly better fuel efficiency norms. I mean, of course, that's part of the process, but where will it end? So that's why we're also kind of really big on this EV, because at some point you say, okay, the grid will clean up and we'll get to that zero emission. So
in other words, initiatives which will result in marginal improvements, or maybe a little bit more than marginal improvements, are good, but they're not good enough.
As long as they take you to that zero emission at some point, right?
Great. Thanks, Sherry, for your thoughts, and we'll come back again to you. But now let me go back to the first speaker of the webinar, Jacob. Jacob, a couple of queries. Just wanted to understand that how have credits for BEVs or battery electric vehicles, in other words, or other alternative powertrains have been included in fuel economy standards in some of the other countries and regions?
Right. So the ICCT actually tracks the application of super credits across fuel economy standards for every region that has implemented them. And what I can do is I can put in the chat the link to the page where there's a table where the ICCT has a table of the super credits. And if you take a look at this, what you'll find is that in the markets where fuel economy regulations are the most mature, markets like the EU, as highlighted before, China, US, UK, Canada, also South Korea is shown there. The first thing that becomes apparent is that the credits for zero emission vehicles, generally battery electric vehicles or fuel cell vehicles, typically don't exceed 3. And only in South Korea do they start at 3. In all of these other countries or economies that I've mentioned, they start at around 2 or 2.5 in the case of Canada. And then they kind of decline and go down to 1. And in many of these cases, already they've gone down to 1, meaning effectively there is no super credit for these alternative powertrain technologies. And what's behind this is the fact that on the one hand, there's this simple recognition that super credits risk watering down the stringency of fuel economy standards. And on the other hand, I think given the fact that there are these steady technology improvements in lithium-ion batteries, including in battery density, durability, and especially rapid cost reductions, that's delivering reductions in the purchase price for electric vehicles. So electric cars are getting closer and closer to conventional cars in terms of upfront purchase price parity. And since EVs are becoming an increasingly mature commercial technology, policymakers increasingly see no need to provide additional incentives, which were the original justification for super credits. So that's kind of the picture of how things look in some of these contexts where there's a long history of fuel economy policies.
Okay. And tell us how much of the emission benefits in each of these scenarios have, let's say, if you look at different segments of the automobile industry, how much of these benefits have come from, let's say, the 2- and 3-wheelers, and how much from cars, and of course, the other big segment of heavy vehicles?
So the answer to that is that it varies regionally, but given the fact that most regulatory policy to date has focused on the biggest fuel-consuming sector, light-duty vehicles, cars and vans, and the biggest emitting sector, most of the reduction in emissions that we've seen from adopted policies to date, more than 80%, has come from regulations focusing on light-duty vehicles. In certain countries like India, a good share of the emissions reductions have also come from 2- and 3-wheelers. And then a smaller share overall, but increasing share has come from regulatory policies on trucks and buses. And in particular, 2 big policies that really move the needle are the EU's CO2 emission standard and the US Phase 3 standard on heavy-duty vehicles. That all changes a bit if we look at the momentum or ambitious scenarios. So to continue to reduce emissions from the road sector overall, a greater focus will be needed at a global level on reducing emissions from trucks and buses, and trucks in particular. And once India has itself set up stringent fuel economy standards on light-duty vehicles, as has been discussed by other speakers here already today, an increasing focus will be needed also on trucks.
Right. And of course, when it comes to contribution from 2 and 3 wheelers, primarily particularly 3 wheelers, India is the only market where you have an example of contribution from this segment. So at this stage, I would also like to appeal to all the attendees to please make the most of this occasion of the presence of such experts in the panel to pose your questions, get your get more information from them, any kind of doubts, clear them, and of course, to get more information about the journey towards an emission-free or a kind of a carbon-neutral transportation scenario. So please keep your questions. Do type in your questions on the Q&A box. In fact, as we speak, I see a few of them. So I would like to take up a question on how, this is from an anonymous attendee. The question is, would low carbon fuels or carbon neutral fuels being considered as part of India's pathway to zero emission, or the pathway to carbon neutrality? As we know, India set a target of 2070. Amit, would you like to take up this question, please?
Yeah, thanks, Sumantra. So we did a very detailed analysis a couple of years back, looking at what fuels, what powertrain technologies can drive the decarbonization of transportation sector. And we concluded that purely in terms of technology, hydrogen fuel cell and battery electric are the only 2 technologies that can deliver technically. But again, if we look at the cost effectiveness, probably battery electric would be the bulk of it. So we also looked at other other technologies, other powertrains, including ethanol. We looked at biodiesel. We looked at compressed natural gas, so on and so forth. And we found that just from the climate perspective, only these 2 technologies can deliver. So some of these technologies may act as a transitioning technology or transitioning fuel, but long-term trajectory is absolutely clear. It has to be zero tailpipe emission vehicles.
Okay, all right. And one question about low emission zones. Since Sherry has also been mentioned, talking about this or LEZ, there's a question on which says LEZs are often seen as an effective tool for improving urban air quality. However, there's a risk of pollution displacement where high emission vehicles are diverted to areas outside the zone, potentially worsening air quality elsewhere in those areas. So how can policymakers design LEZs to minimize this unintended consequence and ensure a more equitable air quality improvement across regions? Sherry, your thoughts? That's a valid point.
Yes, we would never recommend an LEZ just as a kind of a sole policy that is, but there are several complementary policies that would have to go with restricting vehicles in a zone. We would have to strengthen, the last mile connectivity, the public transport, some of these EV policies we're talking about here, so that we see a switch in behavior, a switch in modes of transport, rather than just saying that, okay, you can't come to this zone, so you go to that zone instead, right? So there's several of these. This has been well studied, and you would not do that in isolation. You would definitely have these multiple things that kind of come together to create a holistic policy. Thank you.
There is another question which says, when it comes to ZETs, we can see some uptake in the market. Now that the government has announced some support via the PM e-Drive scheme, what can be the next steps, as well as what other measures should we expect or need from the government side? Dr. Agarwal, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
Maybe,
Are you there, Dr. Agarwal? Maybe he may be finding a technical issue to kind of share his thoughts. But Amit, do you want to take that on?
Sure. I think it's an interesting question. So, couple of things. One is that we believe that the initial corpus of 500 crores will catalyze some demand. We don't know how much, but maybe let's say few thousand vehicles come on road. And what it does, two things. One, it kind of acts as a proof of concept, because there is still a question mark with a lot of people. Can electric trucks deliver? I mean, the same question which was there. Can electric two-wheeler deliver? Can electric car deliver? Can electric bus deliver? The same question is there for electric trucks. So I think that proof of concept, the technology demonstration can happen. But then to scale up, we have to look at supply side policy. So a CAFE equivalent or a fuel efficiency regulation for heavy duty vehicle can be a great policy to drive electrification of heavy duty vehicles. Similarly, things like zero emission sales mandate. So if we can look at these two policies, then I think the scale up will happen much fast. But I think for that to happen, there is a little bit of question mark on technology demonstration and technology capability. That I think will be resolved with the initial 500 crore corpus from PME Drive.
Right. Another question, again, staying with India, is that is India relying primarily on off-grid EV charging to meet the respective demand for clean electricity? This comes from, I guess it's someone from overseas, Alexandra Newbert.
So mostly I think the charging is happening with grid only. And I think the question is, how do you clean the grid? And I think that's where I think India has already committed to 500 gigawatt hour of renewable by 2030. So I think there are two things which is coming out very clearly. One is we have to produce as much as green electrons as possible. And that can happen through renewable, and India is moving out that journey. We can absolutely scale up that transition. The second is, what do you do with that green electrons? And I think battery electric does offer a great potential, because you can store the green electrons in your battery and power the vehicles as green miles. So I think if we bring the renewable energy story together in this, we will see a much faster and a much cleaner uptake of electrification.
That's right. In fact, that will also help in the EV industry's argument about being clean at the overall level when it comes to the source of electricity, which also powers or charges the vehicles, right? Because that will be very key. And, Amit, I was also thinking, because since, yes, when it comes to these technologies, hydrogen and EVs, BEVs I'm talking about, also as a hydrogen fuel also, of course, they are the lead. They can play a very significant role. But so can, let's say, options like synthetic fuels, which someone also I noticed in the audience also pulled up, synthetic fuels or e-fuels as they're called. So is that also the thing is worth considering and worth considering seriously with backing up with some policy interventions also to kind of make it also part of the bouquet of energy options for the new age mobility, which in other words is sustainable mobility?
So maybe, I don't know if Jacob is here. Jacob, if you want to share some insight from the e-fuel story from
Yeah, please. Because I think, yeah, you're right. Because in Europe, e-fuels is a more talked about topic, and some of the OEMs, Porsche, for example, if I'm not wrong, has partnered with someone to set up a e-fuel production unit also.
Thanks. So Amit already kind of outlined the in-depth study that he did investigating, competing powertrain and fuel options in India. And I think, from a European perspective, lots of the things that he summarized also hold. If you look at all these competing technologies, it's important to keep in mind a couple of key metrics. One is the life cycle emissions reduction potential, or the well-to-wheels emission reduction potential, that is including also the fuel supply. Another is the cost of the alternative option and the cost differential, or the cost premium that you would need from the alternative option. And maybe, if we're talking about e-fuels, effectively, given the fact that there isn't much green hydrogen production or low emissions hydrogen production coming online, well, about 1% of hydrogen production currently is low emissions hydrogen production, and lots of the announcements aren't coming online as fast as we had hoped. The scale up is something that will take at least through 2035 before you start to see a kind of material impact of green hydrogen, and hydrogen is going to be needed for these e-fuels. The third is the energy efficiency of competing technology options. And I think Amit also mentioned that battery electric vehicles, when you look at how much of the primary energy is actually going to the wheels, the electricity is going to power the wheels, battery electric vehicles really perform quite well on that metric as well. It's important to recognize that all three of these different metrics are related, and taking them one at a time, the ICCT's work on, say, life cycle emissions reduction potential of competing technologies has already demonstrated that battery electric vehicles can lead to durable and deep greenhouse gas emission reductions on a well-to-wheel basis, and indeed on a life cycle basis, even in contexts where the grid is quite heavily reliant on coal and natural gas. Then Amit also kind of highlighted the fact that India is among one of many countries that has already made quite a bit of progress in decarbonizing their electricity provision, the electricity grid. And indeed, electricity is the sector that is poised to decarbonize much faster than any other sector. And if you think that the energy transition stands a chance, then the electricity sector has to lead. So not only are BEVs right now the cleanest option, but they're going to continue to get cleaner faster than any other option. Because they're so efficient, the cost premium is quite a bit lower. So what it looks like is there will be a role for e-fuels and liquid fuels that have a lower emissions intensity than fossil fuels. But what sectors those liquid fuels should go to, and where they can make the most impact and where they make the most economic sense, it's probably not going to be the road sector if they're competing with direct electrification. They are likely to make more sense in shipping or aviation, where direct electrification is much more of a technologically challenging thing to achieve.
That's an interesting perspective. Thanks for that. They will definitely have a role, but perhaps they need to weigh the kind of sectors where they will have a more impact, and possibly the other transportation sectors that you mentioned about. Those could also be good, maybe stronger candidates to adopt policies. Earlier I was also mentioning about since we're talking about emissions and the new regulations. Starting from Euro 6, Euro 7, and which will be in India, it will be the BS7. We'll have the new component or new dimension of pollutants, PM pollutants from generated from tires and brakes. So there's also a question related to that. This is from Ron Onder. The question is, since nearly 45% of PM 2.5 pollutants are generated by brake and tire abrasion, what technologies or policies are being developed to tackle this issue? Additionally, what measures are policymakers considering to counter the already existing PM pollutants that have settled on roads and in drainage systems, given that these particles eventually enter the air as dust, of course, or water bodies through rain and runoff? Interesting question there.
All right. This is a bit out of my area of competency. I know the ICCT has done a bit of work analyzing the Euro 7 standards, and I've put up on screen here a paper focusing on kind of pollutant emittent by pollutant emittent and source by source, the ICCT's analysis of the Euro 7 standards, including of tire particle emissions. This statistic that you mentioned of 45% of PM 2.5 emissions coming from tire particles, if I understood correctly,
Yes.
that's to me. I would imagine that varies depending on kind of the national and even city level context that you're talking about. Indeed, because electric vehicles weigh a bit more because of the battery weight, all else being held equal, they may be likely to emit slightly more tire particle emissions, but there are technologies that exist to reduce tire abrasion. There are trade-offs between, road safety and durability and reduced tire abrasion that need to, legitimately be considered. But the Euro 7 is already, as you mentioned, is already targeting reductions in tire particle emissions, not only for light-duty vehicles, cars, but also for medium and heavy-duty vehicles and high-load heavy-duty vehicles, as shown in this figure. First new vehicles being subject to type approval, and then all new vehicles, and then all new tires on the market will be subject to these new standards under Euro 7. As for the specific technologies to reduce PM, both from the tailpipe and, say, road wear emissions, tire particle emissions, braking emissions, that's quite a detailed technology discussion that, perhaps Dr. Agarwal would be better equipped to answer. But I'd be happy to put this link into the chat and make the link for the person who asked the question with the ICCT expert on this subject, Jan Dordorf. Thanks.
I appreciate it, Jacob. And I mean, thanks for sharing this information also. And so Dr. Agarwal, if he's back, we will have his thoughts on this as well. But generally, I mean, we are approaching the end of this edition of the webinar. So before we kind of to conclude, just wanted to would request each of the speakers to really share your thoughts in maybe 30 seconds or so in terms of this transition or the journey from fuel to the new age in industry of less emission or zero emission vehicles. What are the 2 or 3 big opportunities and 2 or 3 hurdles and that are on the way, and how can they be overcome? Starting with you to get a global perspective, Jacob.
Okay, yeah. So I think this transition to electric vehicles poses a lot of challenges and opportunities, and they're very related. They're very closely linked, both. And a lot of the opportunities have to do with securing this place in the value chain in the EV battery and EV battery and electric vehicle value chain. India has this very much in its crosshairs with the production-linked incentive schemes and with other efforts to secure critical minerals and a domestic industrial supply chain, even up to battery recycling and reuse, as do a lot of other economies. The challenge will be ensuring that a resilient and reliable supply of batteries will be coming online in the timescales needed to really make a dent in greenhouse gas emissions, not just for India, but for all of the countries as they start to look forward to this EV transition. That means diversifying from currently very consolidated supply chains, gradually building up multiple sources for every step of the EV value chain.
Sherry, your thoughts?
I mean, I'm coming in from a perspective of an EV owner here.
Yeah,
So
please.
the opportunities and the hurdles, definitely seeing a lot of, when we started off, we had one charger in the city, which was the place which sold us the car. To now we have, I mean, it's kind of well covered, but the hurdles in charging space, I think one thing we've covered in a lot of these kind of conversations is that you really need to be able to charge it from your own electricity in your own parking spot and your own, so not kind of rely on the commercial chargers. It's nice to have those, of course, but for day to day, to be able to have, so some of the policies that kind of address that with RWAs, with communities who have a lot of myths that are going around. So would like to kind of have some government support for that kind of thing for the chargers. Thanks.
Sherry, if I also were to look at it, you as a representative of the constituency of EV owners, what, let's say, from someone like you, who lives in Delhi NCR, what is your average usage of your EV on a daily basis?
I have a bit of a commute, so I would say probably two. I mean, I charge every 3 or 4 days, so a couple 100 kilometers a week.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and with the current level of charging infrastructure, and of course including the option that you have at your home, do you face any hurdle sometimes, or do you think it's good as a
I mean, for city level driving, you're talking about new EVs coming in with 500 kilometers range. So city level driving, if you have something at home, there's absolutely no problem. But the problem is when people have to share a charger, like you have these 3 or 4 chargers, commercial chargers, and in a society, and then you're kind of coordinating with your neighbors. When can I charge? There's somebody else parked in the spot. There's a lot of these kind of things that nuisances
operational
that don't
issues,
need to be there.
Right. Okay. We wouldn't want to miss out on answering the questions that our attendees have posed. So just 2 questions which have come in, and maybe I will request Amit to take them up. Here's a question from Shashank Dolakia, and who seems to be an investor. He says that as an investor who is willing to support freight electrification in the heavy-duty segment, there seems to be some resistance from corporates to adopt EVs despite providing discount to their existing freight rates. What would push corporates to actually start adopting EVs? That is adoption of, let's say, in the range of 100 to 200 EVs instead of a smaller numbers of pilot projects like 5 to 10. Amit, what would encourage them, you think? And how the policy intervention?
It's a very good question, and this is something that we have seen in number of consultation that we are a part of. While a lot of companies want to shift to electric, but they don't want to give any green premiums. And therefore, the question remains, how can we transition? So I think it ultimately boils down to economics. So one, if we can create a demand, the demand will drive the competition, and the competition will drive the price reduction. The big question is, how do we create demand? And that's where I think there's a great learning from what Jacob presented, that if you create supply side regulations through CAFE standards or sales mandate, then you create demand. I mean, look at the CNG story. When CNG came in Delhi, there was not a single OEM ready with the vehicle. There was no refueling infrastructure. But as the CNG mandate came, everything fell in place. So once we create these mandates through sales mandate or through regulations, we will create demand. And as I said, when there's demand, there's competition and the prices will come down.
Right. And then, as I said, it will be a virtuous cycle, I mean, each feeding the other. Another question which I would pose to both Jacob and you, Amit, but let me go to Jacob first, because it's also, I'm also curious to understand if what's the level of battery recycling which is happening there in Europe, particularly in France, if Jacob can share some insights there. The question is as follows. This is from Henry Kamau. Has the battery recycling industry picked up well enough to handle increased volumes, and what is the percentage of recovery of key materials in the process? any insights that you can share, Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very forward-looking regulation, the EU's battery regulation that was passed, I think, about a year and a half ago now. The fact is that we aren't seeing many electric vehicles coming to their useful end of life yet.
Yeah.
So that the volumes of batteries that are need to be recycled is still quite small, but that's going to change over the next 5 years, and there will be a need to ramp up the capabilities for battery recycling. There are some interesting reports both from the ICCT and the IEA about what the ramp up might look like. There are a lot of startups and more established companies already in this space that are getting ready to handle the increasing volumes of recycled batteries, end-of-life batteries that we're expecting. There are questions about the cost of recycling batteries and using recycled materials for batteries versus using primary materials. And that's why regulations also on this side, for battery recycling and the share of recycled materials going into batteries, like the EU's regulation, are important. As I referred to previously, one big challenge is going to be securing resilient and reliable supplies of the critical materials that you need to make batteries, and one solution is using end-of-life materials. And so this is another way in which the EU regulation is forward-looking. We don't see the same focus on the need for battery recycling in policies, for instance, of the United States. And I think that's a bit short-sighted, given the era that we're entering, where there's going to be a lot of competition for securing these mineral supplies. Short answer, we're not seeing great volumes yet, but you can expect that to change very soon. There are a lot of companies in the space, investors in the space, and I think in Europe at least, they're going to be able to scale up quite cleanly as the volumes of end-of-life batteries start to scale up as well.
Thank you there, Jacob. You'd like to give an India perspective, Amit?
No, I think this is also relevant for.
I mean, it's also relevant applicable for India, because the end of life, the EVs have not really reached the end of life yet in terms of.
Absolutely. And I think as we probably embark on the journey, the number increase we'll see. But I think one of the things that we have seen, at least from Europe, is that whatever recycling is happening, they are able to kind of extract almost 97-98% of the material from the battery. So in that sense, it does provide at least a technical answer that technically recycling is very, very effective in case of the high-end chemical. Yeah.
In fact, that's what also was running in my mind, because at least among the 3-4 early movers in the battery recycling business, one of them, and I'm pretty sure the story will be more or less the same for all of them, is that the kind of recovery of critical minerals, materials from the battery is in the range of mid to high 90s. And that is the answer to that question of what's the percentage of recovery. So if that's the case, and I'm sure it may not be 100%, but definitely it will be in that region. So even if it is above 96, 97%, and then you get the high volume of batteries coming into the system for recycling, I'm sure that will also enhance the overall green quotient of EVs, because as they go back into new batteries, I'm sure it will also have a positive impact on the carbon footprint. So yes, there is another question, but part of the question is already answered. That the question is, though technically not ZEVs, where do you see e-fuels fitting in the carbon neutral debate? That's already answered. The second component to the question, what about H2 as a combustion fuel? Amit, you touched upon hydrogen in the context of electric mobility, but hydrogen also as a combustion fuel, because H2 ICE is also being an increasingly discussed topic especially in the commercial vehicle segment of late.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of conversation around H2 ICE. We have not seen any action as of now, but a lot of conversation, and especially in the heavy-duty vehicle space. So we'll see what how it pans out, because one is a very limited set of operation in close kind of quadrant is one, but having kind of highway level of operation H2I. So we are also monitoring that conversation in India very closely. But again, this is only for heavy duty vehicle segment as we speak.
Okay, right. And in fact, as you rightly said, there have been a lot of pilots and at a high scale also being kind of conducted as we speak, but it's still not commercialized. From what we understand, 26, 27 and 2026, 27 is the, in that time period will be when we will see the first set of trucks running on H2I technology being deployed for commercial applications. So now we have large conglomerates like Reliance, Ashok Leyland, Daimler India Commercial Vehicles being Tata Motors, of course, working closely on developing this technology in association with, let's say, suppliers like Cummins. So I'm sure there's a combined efforts happening at the industry level, and I'm sure there'll be some efficient solutions which will come and be a good part of the overall pie of technologies, clean technologies for the ultimate objective of carbon neutrality. So as we speak, we have hit, in fact, we have just a couple of minutes overshot the time. So that also showcases how engaging this discussion was. And of course, that was driven primarily by the topic and all the expert panelists in this edition of the webinar series. Once again, thank you, Sherry, Jacob, Dr. Agarwal. Thank you, Amit, for sharing your views and perspectives. Really appreciate. And for Jacob, special thanks for that very informative and insightful presentation, which set the tone so well for this edition of the webinar. And to all our attendees, thank you very much for your active participation. And we hope you found this edition and all the deliberation very useful. And I'm pretty sure there'll be some who also represent organizations that have that play a critical and active role in policy framing. So I'm sure many of these deliberations also served as feedback and inputs for your projects. So once again, thank you. Last words from you, Amit.
No, thanks a lot, Sumanta, for moderating this excellent webinar. Again, thank you, ET Auto, for partnering with ICCT on this webinar. Really, really insightful and great conversation. And thank you once again.
Thanks. Till we meet again for the next edition of our webinar series, which I can assure you, it will be yet another very engaging and pertinent topic for the transportation stroke mobility industry and all the stakeholders there. So once again, Jacob, Dr. Agarwal, Sherry, Amit, thank you very much for your participation, and we'll meet again in the next edition of the webinar series. And to all the attendees, thank you and best wishes.